My name is Arya. I'm in my early 30s, and for most of my adult life, I've been the kind of person people describe as steady, dependable, calm, the one who doesn't complain, doesn't raise her voice, doesn't make things uncomfortable. I work with my mind more than my hands, and I've always believed that if you do your job well and treat people fairly, things eventually balance out. That belief is part of why this story exists. From the outside, people often assumed I was lucky just to be where I was. They saw my quiet demeanor and mistook it for a lack of ambition. They saw my politeness and read it as permission. I was often told I should be thankful for the opportunity, for the experience, for being included. I was told to be matkel, more grateful, while being underpaid. This isn't a story about revenge. There's no shouting, no dramatic walkouts, no villain speeches. It's about something slower and, in some ways, harder to notice. What happens when a person stops internalizing other people's expectations and starts listening to their own quiet math. Because of gratitude, I learned that the long way has limits. Grateful didn't pay my rent. What you're about to hear is a first-person account of how I went from being useful and invisible to being calm and unmovable. It's about small dismissals that didn't look like abuse, moments that didn't seem bad enough to protest, and a version of myself who kept waiting for fairness to arrive on its own. There's no hero moment here, just clarity, timing, and restraint. Over the next hour or so, I'll walk you through how people saw me, what I noticed long before I said anything, and how silence, when chosen deliberately, can become leverage instead of surrender. I won't exaggerate events, and I won't simplify people into monsters. Everyone involved thought they were being reasonable. That's part of what made it work for so long. If you've ever been told you should be grateful for less than you needed, if you've ever stayed quiet because you didn't want to seem difficult, if you've ever wondered whether calm endurance is the same thing as strength, then you'll understand this story. Before we begin, let me ask you something gently. No pressure to answer out loud. Have you ever realized you were carrying more than your share, only after someone told you it was your job to smile about it? To them, I was the reliable one, not the star, not the visionary, not the problem solver who got credit when something went right. I was the person who made sure things didn't go wrong. And because nothing exploded, no one looked too closely at who was holding the structure together. In meetings, my name came up attached to phrases like, Arya will handle it, or she's good with details. Compliments that sound generous until you realize they're also a ceiling. I wasn't invited to shape decisions. I was invited to execute them. Quietly, efficiently, without fuss. I didn't mind at first. In fact, I leaned into it. I was new once, and being dependable felt like safety. I watched how louder people were treated, how mistakes were forgiven if they were wrapped in confidence. I chose a different route. I learned the systems, I learned people's habits, I learned where information lived and who forgot to document things. Over time, my inbox became the place problems landed when no one else wanted them. To them, I was calm because nothing bothered me. In reality, I was calm because I noticed everything. I noticed how my workload grew without conversation, how responsibilities were added with a smile and never removed, how my job description quietly expanded while my title stayed exactly the same. I noticed that when budgets were discussed, my role was framed as support, even when entire projects stalled without my input. But I didn't dramatize it. I told myself this was normal, that this was what being a team player looked like, that visibility would come later. They underestimated me in small, ordinary ways. They spoke over me in meetings, then asked me afterward to send notes. They forgot to loop me into decisions I would later be expected to implement. When deadlines were met, it was the team's success. When something slipped, the question was quietly redirected toward me. Never accusatory, just implied. No one was cruel, that's important to say. This wasn't abuse. It was something more subtle and more common, a collective agreement about who I was allowed to be. And I played my part well enough that no one questioned it. When compensation reviews came around, my manager smiled sympathetically. He told me budgets were tight, those raises were complicated, that I should be proud of my stability. At one point, he said, almost kindly, that I should be grateful to have a role that wasn't going anywhere. That was the first time the word grateful landed wrong, because I was grateful. I showed it every day through output, flexibility, and silence. But gratitude had become the justification for imbalance. The more adaptable I was, the more adaptable they expected me to be. To them, I was low risk, predictable. Someone who wouldn't make waves. They didn't see the notebook. They didn't see how I wrote things down. Not emotionally, but precisely. Dates, shifts in expectations, verbal agreements that never made it to email. Tasks that temporarily became permanent. They didn't notice because I never waved it around. I never threatened. I never hinted. I just observed And because I didn't complain, they assumed I was fine. Because I didn't demand, they assumed I didn't need. Because I was composed, they assumed I was content. Invisibility can look a lot like peace from the outside. If you asked them back then who I was, they would have said I was lucky to be there, that I had a good attitude, that I was supportive, that I wasn't the kind of person who cared about titles or money too much. They were wrong about only one thing. I cared. I just hadn't decided what to do about it yet. The first small cut didn't happen during a fight. There was no raised voice, no tense meeting, no moment that would stand out if you asked anyone else to remember it. It happened in a hallway. We had just wrapped up a project that ran late for weeks. I had coordinated vendors, rewritten timelines, smoothed over client concerns, and quietly absorbed tasks that weren't technically mine because someone had to. The launch went well. Everyone was relieved. There was that brief collective exhale that comes after stress finally releases. As we walked back toward our desks, my manager laughed and said, "See, this is why we're lucky to have you." Lucky? Then, almost as an afterthought, he added, "By the way, I approved the bonus allocations. Marketing's getting a nice bump for this one." I waited, not expectantly, just long enough to see if my name would follow. It didn't. I remember nodding, smiling, saying something neutral like, "Glad it worked out." That was it. Conversation over. At my desk, I opened my inbox and saw the thank you email sent to the team. Generic, warm, inclusive. No specifics, no acknowledgement of who carried what. Again, nothing dramatic, but something registered. I realized this was the first time my contribution had been acknowledged verbally while being dismissed materially. The praise existed only as language. The reward existed only for others, and I was expected to hold both facts at once without discomfort. At lunch, a colleague joked, "At least you're indispensable." She meant it as comfort. I smiled because that's what you do when people say things they believe are compliments. But indispensable is a strange word. It sounds like security until you realize it can also mean trapped. If something can't function without you, it rarely gets upgraded. It just gets used. Later that week, during a one-on-one, I asked a careful question. Not about money directly, about growth, about what the path forward looked like. My manager leaned back in his chair and said, "Honestly, Arya, you're in a good place. A lot of people would love your stability." Then came the sentence that lodged itself quietly in my chest. "You should be grateful. Not everyone gets this kind of trust." Trust, as if trust and compensation existed on the same scale. I didn't argue. I didn't counter. I thanked him for the feedback and left the room exactly as I entered it. Calm, agreeable, contained. But that night, sitting at my kitchen table, I opened my notebook. I wrote the date. I wrote the project name. I wrote who received bonuses. I wrote the words lucky and grateful in quotation marks. Not because I was angry, because I wanted to remember how easily value could be reframed when it became inconvenient. This was the first time I noticed how the language worked, how appreciation was offered in place of equity, how being trusted often meant being leaned on, not lifted. No one else noticed the cut because it didn't bleed, but it changed how I listened. From that point on, every compliment came with a question attached. What is this replacing? Every reassurance carried an undertone. What conversation is being avoided right now? I didn't withdraw. I didn't harden. I didn't suddenly become distant. I just stopped assuming good intentions were the same thing as good outcomes. And that was the beginning. Not of conflict, but of clarity. Once you accept the first small cut, the body does something strange. It adjusts, not consciously, not with intention. It just recalibrates what feels normal. What once would have made you pause now barely registers. And that's how disrespect survives. Not by being loud, but by being familiar. After that hallway conversation, nothing visibly changed. My workload didn't spike overnight. No one suddenly treated me worse. In fact, things felt smoother. I was trusted more, pulled into more important conversations, given access without authority, responsibility without leverage. I told myself this was progress. When tasks came to me last minute, I reframed them as confidence in my competence. When decisions were made without my input, I told myself leadership had its reasons. When my role blurred beyond its original boundaries, I reminded myself that flexibility was a strength. This is how normalization works. You build a story that protects everyone involved, including the system that benefits from your silence. There was a rhythm to it. I would notice something was off. I would feel a brief internal resistance. Then I would explain it away. They're under pressure. This is temporary. I don't want to seem difficult. Now isn't the right time. Each justification was small, reasonable, mature, and together they built a pattern where my needs were always postponed and their expectations were always met. The language stayed polite. That's what made it tricky. No one said, "You don't deserve more." They said, "Let's revisit this later." No one said, "Your work is invaluable." They said, Everyone's stretched right now. No one said, "You're being taken advantage of." They said, "You're such a team player." And I accepted these phrases because they sounded like respect, even when the outcomes didn't reflect it. I watched colleagues with less experience negotiate raises by being visible about their discomfort. I watched others fail loudly and be given resources to recover. I watched assertiveness be interpreted as leadership, while restraint was interpreted as contentment. Still, I stayed quiet, not because I didn't notice, but because I believed there was dignity in endurance. That if I just kept showing up with consistency and integrity, someone would eventually see the imbalance and correct it. That belief felt moral, almost noble. What I didn't realize then was that systems don't correct what's working, and my silence was working beautifully, for everyone except me. There was a moment, months in, when a junior colleague asked me how I managed so much without burning out. I gave her a careful answer about boundaries and pacing. She laughed and said, "I hope I'm as chill as you one day." Chill. I went home that night and stared at my calendar, at the overlapping deadlines, at the meetings booked on top of each other because Aria can multitask. I realized that my calm exterior had become a justification for excess. And still, I stayed. I told myself that leaving would look ungrateful, that pushing too hard would erase the trust I'd built, that making noise might make things worse. So instead of speaking, I adapted. I optimized. I streamlined. I absorbed. And with every adjustment, the line moved slightly farther away. By the time I recognized the pattern clearly, it no longer felt shocking. It felt normal, expected, almost earned. That's the danger. Disrespect doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it waits for you to agree to it quietly, again and again, until you forget what fair used to feel like. And some nice. I didn't forget completely, but I did stop expecting anyone else to notice it for me. Every system has roles people fall into, not because they're written down, but because they're convenient. Mine became clear the day I realized no one asked whether I could take something on anymore. They just assumed I would. I was the constant. If someone went on leave, their responsibilities drifted toward me. If a process was unclear, I was expected to clarify it. If a project stalled, I was asked to take a look. Not officially, not with a title change, just quietly, as if it were the natural order of things. Reliable, useful, invisible. That was the role. I didn't resist because the role came wrapped in praise. People trusted me. People depended on me. People spoke well of me in rooms I wasn't in. At least that's what I was told. But dependency is not the same as respect, and praise is not the same as power. The clearest sign came during a restructuring conversation. Leadership announced new positions, new titles, and new lanes. The room buzzed with anticipation. I listened carefully, mapping how my responsibilities aligned with the changes. When the org chart was shared, my name was exactly where it had always been. No expansion, no adjustment, no acknowledgement that half the new roles were built on functions I'd already been performing. After the meeting, someone patted my shoulder and said, "Don't worry, Aria, you're the glue. We'd fall apart without you." Glue? Glue doesn't get promoted. Glue just keeps things stuck together. That was when I understood something fundamental. My value had been defined by how quietly I could carry weight. The less I asked for recognition, the more comfortable they became assigning me that role. And once a role becomes comfortable for others, it's very hard for them to imagine you differently. I saw it in how suggestions landed. When I offered ideas, they were noted politely, then revisited later by someone else with more visibility. When I flagged risks, they were minimized until they materialized, at which point I was asked to fix them. I wasn't ignored. I was relied on. And that reliance masked the imbalance so well that even I had trouble naming it. The role also came with emotional expectations. I was expected to be understanding, flexible, available. When timelines shifted, I was the one who absorbed the impact. When tensions rose, I was the calming presence. When someone else dropped the ball, I picked it up without commentary. Because that's who I was to them. And because I played it well, they stopped seeing it as an effort. There was a quiet moment one evening when I stayed late to resolve an issue that technically belonged to another department. The office was empty. The lights hummed softly. I looked around and realized no one would ever know I was there. Not because they didn't care, but because the system didn't require them to. I wasn't angry. I was clear. This role wasn't assigned with malice. It was assigned with convenience. And convenience rarely questions itself. I understood then that waiting to be seen differently was pointless. Roles don't dissolve on their own. They have to be outgrown or abandoned. But I didn't abandon mine yet. I was still learning how it worked, what it cost me, and what it quietly gave me access to. The day something shifted didn't look important. There was no argument, no announcement, no moment where I decided anything consciously. If you had asked me that morning how I felt about my job, I would have said, fine. Busy, but fine. The shift happened in a quiet, almost boring moment. I was reviewing a contract draft late in the afternoon, something I'd been asked to just glance at before it went out. I wasn't a lawyer, but by then I knew enough to recognize patterns, clauses that favored one side, language that looked neutral but wasn't. As I read, I realized the agreement formalized responsibilities I'd already been carrying for months, without any reference to my role, compensation, or authority. It locked in expectations that had previously been informal, flexible, reversible. Now they would be permanent. I felt something settle in my chest, not anger, not panic. Finality. This wasn't about appreciation or recognition anymore. This was about alignment, about the gap between what I was doing and what I was officially acknowledged for, about how easy it was for my silence to be converted into an obligation. I set the document down and leaned back in my chair. For the first time, I didn't ask, how do I make this work? I asked, what am I agreeing to by staying quiet? That question changed everything, because once you ask it, you can't unask it. I thought about the rent increase notice sitting on my kitchen counter, about how carefully I'd budgeted, how often I told myself things would balance out soon, about the phrase that had been offered so casually months earlier, you should be grateful. Grateful didn't pay my rent. And suddenly that wasn't bitterness, it was math. I realized I had been confusing patience with progress, endurance with strategy. I had been waiting for fairness to emerge organically, as if time alone corrected the imbalance. It doesn't. That afternoon, I sent the contract back with neutral comments, clarifying questions. Nothing confrontational, nothing raised alarms. Outwardly, nothing changed. Internally, something had. I stopped interpreting silence as default. I started seeing it as a choice. And if silence were a choice, then it could be used intentionally. That was the shift. Not toward anger, toward agency. I didn't decide to leave. I didn't decide to fight. I didn't even decide to ask for more. Yet, I decided to observe differently. I began noticing how decisions were justified, who benefited, who absorbed risk, which conversations happened in writing and which were kept verbal. I noticed how often I was positioned as a solution without being present for the problem definition. And I noticed something else too. I had access, not the flashy kind, the quiet kind. I saw how processes actually worked behind the scenes. I understood dependencies that others overlooked. I knew where documentation was thin and where assumptions were doing heavy lifting. I had been so focused on being fair that I hadn't realized how informed I'd become. That knowledge didn't make me powerful overnight, but it grounded me. For the first time, I wasn't waiting to be seen. I was preparing to see clearly. Once silence becomes a choice, it changes texture. Before, my quiet was reactive. It was a way to keep things smooth, to avoid friction, to be agreeable in rooms where agreeableness was rewarded. But after that afternoon with the contract, my silence shifted from habit to intention. And no one noticed. That's the thing about quiet people. When they change internally, the outside world rarely recalibrates right away. Everyone assumes you're still the same because you look the same. I kept doing my work. I met deadlines. I answered messages promptly. I nodded in meetings. On the surface, I was exactly who I'd always been. Underneath, I was listening differently. I stopped filling in gaps automatically. When instructions were vague, I asked for clarification in writing. When responsibilities drifted toward me, I acknowledged them without immediately absorbing them. When someone said, "Can you just handle this?" I responded with, "Happy to. Can you confirm scope and priority?" Polite, neutral, documented. It wasn't resistance, it was precision. People interpreted it as me being more thoughtful lately. One colleague joked that I was getting corporate. Another said, "I wish I had your patience." They still mistook restraint for passivity. What they didn't realize was that by choosing when to speak and when not to, I was collecting something far more useful than sympathy: patterns. I noticed who panicked when things weren't immediately resolved. I noticed which managers relied on urgency to bypass accountability. I noticed how often decisions were made verbally and later remembered selectively. So I stopped letting things stay verbal. After meetings, I sent recap emails. Brief, factual. Per our discussion, next steps are... I didn't accuse, I didn't correct, I just recorded. The notebook stayed closed. Not emotionally charged, methodical. Dates, names, outcomes, not to use against anyone, but to anchor reality when memories get convenient. Silence, I learned, doesn't mean absence. It means control over timing. And timing is everything. There were moments when I could have spoken up and didn't. Not because I was afraid, but because I was learning how people responded when I didn't rescue them immediately. Some adapted, some grew uncomfortable. Some revealed how much they had been leaning on my predictability. I watched calmly. The irony was that the more deliberate I became, the more I was trusted. People assumed my quiet meant agreement. They filled the space with their own assumptions, their own words. And words, when offered freely, can be revealing. I learned which priorities were flexible and which weren't. I learned what leadership cared about publicly versus privately. I learned how often phrases like, "we're all in this together," were used right before responsibility was unevenly distributed. And still, no confrontation. That was important to me. I wasn't interested in winning an argument. I was interested in understanding the structure I was standing inside. Silence gave me that vantage point. At some point, I realized something subtle but powerful. I was no longer emotionally invested in being understood. I was invested in being accurate. That shift freed up an enormous amount of energy. I stopped rehearsing conversations in my head, stopped hoping someone would notice, stopped waiting for validation. I was choosing my moments. And when you choose your moments, you stop reacting to other people's urgency. They still saw me as calm, still saw me as accommodating, still underestimated how intentional that calm had become. They didn't know that silence, once chosen, can be louder than protest. What they never noticed wasn't a secret plan or a sudden transformation. It was consistency. While everything looked the same on the surface, I was doing something different underneath. I wasn't plotting, I wasn't scheming, I was preparing in the most unremarkable way possible. I was learning, not in a dramatic, late-night kind of way. In small pockets of time, 15 minutes here, an hour there. I read policies I'd previously skimmed. I compared my responsibilities to formal role definitions. I revisited contracts I'd helped implement but never benefited from. I paid attention to language, especially the parts that looked harmless. Words like temporary, phrases like just for now, assurances, as we'll circle back. I started mapping how often those words applied to me and how rarely they applied upward. I also started documenting outcomes. Not feelings, not impressions, outcomes. What happened when timelines shifted? Who absorbed the delay? Which departments were shielded? Which ones weren't? Patterns emerged quickly once I looked for them. I realized that much of the organization's operational continuity depended on informal knowledge. Knowledge I held because I'd been there long enough, paid attention, and cared enough to notice. I knew which systems talked to each other and which only pretended to. I knew where redundancies were assumed but didn't exist. I knew which external partners relied on my responses to function smoothly. None of this was classified. None of it was hidden. It was simply unacknowledged. And because it was unacknowledged, it was unprotected. That was when preparation stopped being abstract and became practical. I cleaned up my files, standardized documentation, made sure my work was traceable and defensible. Not because I planned to leave abruptly, but because clarity protects you, whether you stay or go. I reviewed my employment agreement carefully, not with suspicion, just with curiosity. I noticed what it promised and what it didn't. I noticed where flexibility was expected of me, but not reciprocated in writing. I also started talking, quietly, to people outside my immediate circle, not complaining, not venting, asking neutral questions, how roles were scoped elsewhere, how compensation bands worked in similar organizations, what normal looked like beyond the bubble I was in. The answers were informative. I learned that my role, as it existed in practice, sat well above my title, that my compensation lagged behind was not because I lacked leverage, but because I hadn't used any, that what I had interpreted as loyalty was being interpreted as acceptance. No one had lied to me. They just hadn't corrected me. And why would they? All of this happened without urgency, without confrontation, without anyone realizing I was changing how I understood my position. I still helped. I still delivered. I still showed up. But I stopped over-functioning emotionally. I stopped smoothing over gaps that weren't mine to fill. I let small frictions exist long enough for them to be seen. That alone shifted dynamics. People began asking more questions, following up more carefully, looping others in sooner, not because I demanded it, but because I no longer preemptively absorbed everything. What they never noticed was that I was becoming self-contained. I wasn't waiting for permission to evaluate my worth. I was gathering evidence, not to punish anyone, to ground myself. By the time anyone sensed a change, it felt subtle, hard to name, like something familiar that no longer behaves the way it used to. And subtlety was exactly the point. The private reveal didn't arrive with excitement. There was no rush of adrenaline, no sense of triumph, just a quiet, almost sobering clarity, the kind that settles in your body before your mind catches up. It happened one evening as I sat at my desk at home, papers spread out in front of me. Notes, policies, timelines, and role descriptions from other companies. Nothing dramatic, just information, finally placed side by side. And suddenly, the picture sharpened. I saw the gap, not emotionally but structurally. What I was doing versus what I was contracted to do. What I was responsible for versus what I was protected for. What I was compensated for versus what the role would cost to replace. That last one lingered. Because once you understand replacement cost, you understand leverage. Not leverage in a threatening way, in a factual way. I realized that my value wasn't theoretical. It was operational, embedded, distributed across systems and relationships in ways that couldn't be easily extracted without disruption. Not chaos, but friction, delay, risk. And here's the part that surprised me most. I didn't feel powerful. I felt calm, because clarity removes urgency. When you know exactly where you stand, you stop scrambling. I also realized something uncomfortable. I had been protecting them from this knowledge as much as they had benefited from my silence. By making myself endlessly adaptable, I had hidden the true scope of my contribution. The reveal wasn't about what they owed me. It was about what I now owed myself: accuracy. I didn't celebrate. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't even write anything dramatic in my notebook. I just drew a line. On one side, what I would continue doing because it aligned with my role, my values, and my capacity. On the other, what I would no longer carry invisibly. This wasn't an ultimatum. It was a boundary, internal, precise, non-negotiable. And I knew, without emotion, that once that line existed, things would change whether I announced it or not. Because systems respond to shifts in input, even when no one names them out loud. The reveal also came with options. I could stay and renegotiate, if conditions allowed. I could leave quietly on my terms. I could transition out in a way that preserved relationships without sacrificing self-respect. For the first time, I wasn't cornered. And that, more than anything, was what made this moment irreversible. Not anger, not resentment. Agency. I slept well that night. Not because everything was resolved, but because nothing was hidden anymore. Clarity creates a strange stillness. Once the private reveal settled, I found myself standing at a decision point that didn't feel dramatic at all. There was no pressure to act immediately, no ticking clock, just a quiet awareness that doing nothing was also a choice, and no longer a neutral one. For the first time, I laid out my options without judgment. I could speak up directly, ask for a formal reevaluation, present the evidence, risk being reframed as suddenly difficult, hope the system responds fairly now that it has been confronted. I could stay silent and continue as before, only now fully aware of the cost. That option felt the heaviest. Not because it was impossible, but because it would require me to participate knowingly in my own erasure. Or I could move, slowly, strategically, without announcement, towards something else. Not as an escape, but as a realignment. None of these options was wrong, but only one was irreversible. That's how I chose. I paid attention to how my body reacted to each scenario. When I imagined staying and pushing for recognition, I felt tense but alert. When I imagined staying and staying quiet, I felt tired in a way that sleep wouldn't fix. When I imagined preparing to leave, carefully, cleanly, I felt steady. Not excited, steady. That told me enough. The decision wasn't about punishment or proving a point. It was about refusing to continue a pattern I could now see clearly. Once you see a pattern, repeating it stops being patience and starts being consent. So I chose the path that didn't require permission. I didn't resign. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't hint. I decided to prepare an exit that would leave no chaos behind, and no part of me behind either. This mattered to me. I didn't want to burn bridges or make enemies, not because I feared them, but because I didn't need conflict to validate my choice. I wanted alignment, not vindication. That meant timing. I looked at project cycles, at dependencies, at moments where transitions naturally occurred. I noted where my absence would require planning, but not panic. I also looked inward. I asked myself hard questions. Was I willing to be misunderstood? Was I okay with people rewriting the story after I left? Was I prepared to walk away without applause? The answer, surprisingly, was yes. Because I wasn't leaving to be seen. I was leaving to be whole. The finality came not from an external trigger, but from an internal shift. I stopped hoping things would change there and started trusting that I could change direction. That's an irreversible decision. Once made, it doesn't demand urgency. It simply reorients every next step. And from that point on, everything I did was deliberate. Moving in silence isn't about secrecy. It's about alignment between intention and action without the noise of justification. Once the decision was made, I didn't feel the need to narrate it. I simply began to act in ways that honored it. Quietly, legally, methodically. I updated my resume, not to escape, but to reflect reality. I translated what I'd been doing into language the market understood. Titles shifted on paper to match the scope. Achievements were framed as outcomes, not effort. Seeing it laid out that way was grounding. I also reviewed my finances with honesty. I calculated how long I could wait, what flexibility I had, what I needed versus what I'd been tolerating. The numbers were sobering, but empowering. For years, gratitude had been used as a moral argument against money. Now money was just information. And information, unlike guilt, is actionable. I began exploring options outside my organization. Conversations were discreet, professional, no venting, no storytelling, just fit, scope, expectations. What surprised me wasn't how interested people were. It was how normal my experience sounded to them. No one told me I should be grateful. No one framed fair compensation as an entitlement. They asked clear questions. They offered clear ranges. They respected boundaries I hadn't even articulated out loud yet. That contrast alone was instructive. Inside my current role, I kept things steady. I documented processes. I clarified handoffs. I made sure my work could stand without me, not as a favor, but as a professional standard. This wasn't self-sacrifice, it was self-respect. I didn't hoard information. I didn't sabotage continuity. I simply stopped being the invisible patch holding together gaps that should have been addressed structurally. Some people noticed small delays. Some asked more questions. I responded calmly, accurately, without apology. There was no confrontation because there was nothing to confront. I was fulfilling my role, precisely as defined. Silence protected my timing. By the time opportunities solidified outside, nothing internally felt urgent. That was intentional. I wanted to leave from a place of stability, not escape. When I finally accepted an offer elsewhere, I sat with the decision for a full day before responding. Not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to feel the difference between impulse and certainty. Certainty is quiet. The consequences didn't arrive as punishment. They arrived as an absence. When I gave notice, the room didn't freeze. No one shouted. There were no accusations. Just surprise. Subtle, contained, poorly hidden behind professional smiles. "Wow," my manager said. "We didn't see this coming." That sentence did more to confirm my decision than anything else. Because of course they didn't. I had been consistent, reliable, calm. I had given no warning, not because I was deceptive, but because I was finally honest with myself instead of managing other people's expectations. At first, the reaction was procedural. HR scheduled meetings, timelines were discussed, transition plans were requested. I agreed to a reasonable handover period. I answered questions, I shared documentation. I did not overextend myself. That was new. As days passed, the impact of my absence began to ripple outward. Not dramatically, but persistently. Small questions surfaced that no one else could answer quickly. Decisions slowed. Dependencies were rediscovered the hard way. People began to realize how much context lived in me. Not because I'd hoarded it, but because I'd been the one connecting dots quietly for years. There were comments. "I didn't realize you handled that too." "Oh, I thought someone else owned this. Can you show me how you usually manage this part?" I did, calmly, once. What I didn't do was fill the space emotionally. I didn't reassure. I didn't apologize for leaving. I didn't downplay the transition. I stayed factual. And facts have weight. Some colleagues grew distant. Others became unusually attentive. A few asked carefully, what made me decide to go? I answered honestly, but gently. I was ready for a role that aligned better with my scope. No blame, no lecture, just alignment. The most telling reactions came from leadership. Suddenly, there were conversations about workload redistribution, about whether my role had been underscoped, about whether compensation structures were due for review. None of that had seemed urgent before. It wasn't anger I saw, it was recalibration. The system was adjusting to a variable it had assumed was constant. And that's when it became clear the consequences weren't personal. They were structural. By removing myself, I revealed what had been propped up quietly for too long. I didn't feel satisfaction watching this unfold. I felt distance, because by then I wasn't inside it anymore, not emotionally. There is a very specific moment when a system realizes it has waited too long. It doesn't announce itself loudly. There's no apology siren, no dramatic confession. It shows up instead as tension in the air, subtle, almost polite, a shift in tone, a carefulness that wasn't there before. I noticed it the week after I gave notice. People began double-checking things they'd never questioned. They asked where files lived, how decisions were usually made, and who else might know certain answers. Questions that revealed an assumption that had gone unexamined for years, that I would always be there to smooth things over. Now I wouldn't be, and that realization unsettled them. Not because I was irreplaceable in a dramatic sense, but because my presence had allowed inefficiencies to remain invisible. I had been absorbing friction so quietly that no one felt the cost until I stopped. That's when urgency arrived. Not urgency born of care, but of recalibration. Calendars filled quickly. Conversations were scheduled, just to check in. People I hadn't spoken to in months suddenly wanted context. My manager began looping in leadership on threads that had previously ended with me. The machine was adjusting. What struck me most was how carefully everyone spoke now. Words were chosen, sentences softened. There was a collective effort to sound appreciative without sounding responsible. Then came the meeting. No agenda, no documentation. Just a calendar invite with a vague title and 2 senior names attached. When I joined, they were already there, smiling in that practiced way that communicates seriousness while trying not to alarm. The tone was warm, respectful, concerned. They thanked me first, for my work, for my dedication, for my reliability. All true, all late. Then came the reframing. "We wish we had known you were unhappy." Unhappy. It was an easy word, a comfortable one. It suggested emotion instead of structure, feeling instead of fact. I corrected it gently. I wasn't unhappy, I said. I was misaligned. The room went still. Not tense, just thoughtful. That word required more work. It didn't allow for reassurance or quick fixes. Misalignment implies systems, not moods. They asked questions next. Had something specific happened? Was there a breaking point? Was compensation part of it? Each question assumed a trigger, a moment they could isolate and respond to, something they could adjust retroactively and call a resolution. I answered honestly. I explained that there wasn't a single incident, that this was cumulative, that the gap between my scope and my role had widened slowly enough to be normalized until it couldn't be. They listened, took notes. Then came the offers. Not a correction, an adjustment, not a restructuring, a reconsideration, not clarity, possibility. They talked about revisiting my title, about reviewing compensation in the next cycle, about how maybe there had been a misunderstanding about how much I was carrying. It was the first time they spoke as if my role had edges. And that mattered. But what mattered more was when it happened. This conversation wasn't driven by recognition. It was driven by consequence. Only now, when my exit was real, did the imbalance become actionable. And that's when I understood something with absolute certainty. This wasn't about me staying. It was about restoring stability. They weren't trying to honor my value. They were trying to reduce disruption. Again, this didn't make them villains. It made them human. Organizations respond to pressure. Unfortunately, the pressure had arrived only after my internal decision had already been completed. I felt no anger in that moment, no triumph, no bitterness. Just distance. Because what they were offering, even if sincere, required me to believe something I no longer did. That fairness would be sustained only as long as my presence demanded it. I declined. Not dramatically, not defensively. I thanked them. I acknowledged the effort. I told them I appreciated the conversation. And I said no. There was a pause. Not awkward, processing. They hadn't expected that. They had assumed, quietly, that patience could always be extended a little further. That once the right language was used, once the right numbers were mentioned, I would return to my place. They hadn't accounted for the fact that I had already moved on without resentment. And that's the part people rarely anticipate. Anger can be negotiated with. Guilt can be leveraged. Frustration can be soothed. Clarity cannot. Once clarity arrives, it doesn't need validation. After that meeting, the urgency changed shape. There were no more offers, no more probing questions, just logistics. Transition plans became more formal. Responsibilities were redistributed, awkwardly at first, then with growing seriousness. I was asked to document things that had never been documented because I had always handled them. I complied, professionally, precisely. What I didn't do was rush. I worked at a sustainable pace. I answered questions once. I didn't preempt needs. I didn't anticipate gaps unless asked. That alone revealed more than any confrontation could have. Some people seemed frustrated, not at me, but at the sudden visibility of complexity they'd never had to face. Others seemed quietly reflective, as if seeing their own assumptions in real time. A few apologized, not for the system, but for not noticing sooner. I accepted those apologies with grace. Not because they fixed anything, but because they were human attempts to bridge a realization that had come too late. As my final weeks approached, the tone softened further. Less urgency, more acceptance. A collective understanding that this chapter was closing, not with blame, but with consequence. On my last day, there were kind words, handshakes, well wishes, nothing dramatic, and that was fitting, because the truth is, nothing could be fixed at that point, not because people didn't care, but because care had arrived after consent had been withdrawn. You can't renegotiate what someone has already outgrown, and you can't retain someone who has already chosen alignment over accommodation. The final confrontation, if it can even be called that, didn't feel like a confrontation at all. It happened 2 days before my last day. My manager asked if we could talk. Not urgently, not formally, just a quiet request, almost tentative. I agreed. We sat in a small conference room with glass walls. Late afternoon light filtered in, softening everything. It was the kind of setting where raised voices would feel out of place. He started by saying he wanted to understand. Not to change my mind, he made a point of that, but to understand what he could have done differently. I believed him. This wasn't damage control anymore. This was a reflection. I took a moment before answering, not to compose myself emotionally, but to be precise. I didn't want to dramatize the truth. I wanted to state it cleanly. I told him that nothing had gone wrong in a way that could be pointed to. There wasn't a moment when I felt disrespected outright, that the issue wasn't cruelty or neglect. It was an accumulation. I explained how small assumptions compound over time, how being dependable can quietly turn into being default, how gratitude, when used as a substitute for fairness, slowly erodes trust, even when intentions are good. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he nodded and said something honest. "I think we thought you were okay because you never said otherwise." That sentence landed gently. And for the first time, I didn't feel the urge to correct it, because both things were true. They assumed, and I allowed the assumption to stand until I didn't. I told him that I didn't regret staying as long as I did. I learned a great deal, that I didn't view the experience as a mistake. But I also told him that once I saw the pattern clearly, I couldn't unsee it, and staying after that point would have meant participating in something I no longer believed in. There was no defensiveness in the room, just recognition. He thanked me for my work, yes, but also for my honesty now. He said he wished the conversation had happened earlier. I said something simple in return, so do I. But I don't think I could have had it earlier without becoming someone I wasn't ready to be yet. That felt true. We stood, shook hands, and that was it. No reconciliation arc, no dramatic closure. Just two people acknowledging the limits of timing. As I walked back to my desk, I felt light. Not relieved exactly, but unburdened. There was nothing left to prove. Nothing left unsaid that mattered. The quiet dominance wasn't in winning the conversation. It was in not needing to. Who I am now isn't dramatically different from who I was then. I'm still calm, still observant, still someone who prefers clarity over conflict. The difference is not in my personality. It's in my posture. I no longer confuse endurance with virtue. For a long time, I believed that being low maintenance was a form of strength, that if I didn't ask for much, I would be respected for it. What I understand now is that systems don't reward restraint unless restraint is paired with boundaries. Now my boundaries are quiet, but unmistakable. In my new role, I speak early, not loudly. I clarify expectations before they blur. I document not out of fear, but out of respect, for myself and for others. I no longer wait to be noticed. I make scope visible by design. What's interesting is how little resistance that creates. When you state your limits calmly and consistently, most people adjust. Not because they're afraid of you, but because clarity makes collaboration easier. I'm paid in alignment with my role now. That matters. Not because money is everything, but because compensation is a signal. It tells you how an organization actually values what you bring beyond language and praise. And I listen to that signal carefully. I don't hold bitterness toward my past workplace. They weren't malicious. They were operating within a system that had learned what it could take without pushback. I changed the input. The output changed. I also changed something internally that feels more important than any title or raise. I stopped outsourcing my self-assessment. I no longer wait for permission to define my worth. I don't need to be seen as easy or grateful to feel secure. I don't absorb discomfort to keep rooms calm at my own expense. That doesn't mean I've become rigid or cold. If anything, I'm more present, because I'm no longer managing resentment beneath the surface. I'm no longer calculating what I owe versus what I'm given. That mental space is free now, for creativity, for rest, for intention. Quiet dominance isn't about control over others. It's about authorship over yourself. And once you claim that, you don't need to announce it. People feel it. There's a version of the story that could end with a lesson neatly tied up in a sentence. Something like, always speak up, or know your worth. But real life is rarely that simple. What I learned wasn't about becoming louder. It was about becoming accurate. For a long time, I believed that if I stayed reasonable, patient, and grateful, fairness would eventually find me. Good systems corrected themselves, that people noticed the imbalance on their own. Sometimes they do. Often they don't, especially when the imbalance is quiet, functional, and convenient. The truth is, no one woke up intending to undervalue me. But intention doesn't cancel impact. And gratitude, when demanded, becomes a way to shift responsibility away from those with power and onto those carrying the load. Being told to be grateful while being underpaid wasn't an insult. It was a signal. It told me how my silence was being interpreted. It told me how much discomfort the system was willing to tolerate. Mine. And it told me that waiting longer wouldn't produce a different outcome. What changed my life wasn't confrontation. It was a withdrawal of consent. I stopped agreeing to a version of myself that existed for other people's comfort. I stopped trading stability for invisibility. I stopped assuming that calm endurance was the same thing as strength. And here's the part that matters most to me. I didn't win by humiliating anyone. I didn't burn bridges. I didn't demand validation. I simply chose alignment over accommodation. Quiet dominance isn't about getting the last word. It's about not needing one. It's about recognizing the moment when patience turns into self-betrayal and choosing calmly to step away from that edge. If you're listening to this and recognizing pieces of yourself, if you've ever been praised instead of compensated, trusted instead of protected, thanked instead of supported, know this. You're not weak for staying. You're not wrong for noticing. And you're not obligated to keep carrying what no one else wants to name. Sometimes the most powerful move is the one that doesn't look like a move at all. Just a quiet decision to stop agreeing to what no longer fits. I'll leave you with one question. Not rhetorical, not urgent, just honest. Where in your life are you being asked to be grateful for something that no longer feels fair? If you feel comfortable, I'd love to read your thoughts in the comments.